Hello everyone, good day. So we are already on chapter 8, sources of long-term financing. So we are done with chapter 7, financial ratios. So in this chapter, we'll be discussing more on sources. In a minute. Okay, I apologize for the dogs. So I'm having trouble recording due to the noise sa mga dogs. Okay, sorry sa akong background. Again nga, noise. So let's continue. So sources of long-term financing. So this is our lesson roadmap for today. We have objectives, sources of long-term financing, equity capital, preference capital, term loans, and debentures. So these are actually the sources of long-term financing. So we'll be discussing each one in the next slide. So the first roadmap, first step of our roadmap is our objective. So we need to identify the different sources of long-term financing. And the second one is to know or discuss its differences. What do you think is the difference between this type of long-term financing and the other type? So that is our objective under this lecture. Okay, identify the difference and what are those long-term sources of long-term financing. So we have our term of the day, so that is notes payable. Okay, so notes payable is the amount of principal due on a formal written promise to pay. So loans from banks are included in this account. So notes payable is short as you have a liability. So nangutang ka. So most of the time, this is nangutang ka on credit. That's why it is more on a written promise. So mura ka gilista sa utang. So nalista na ka. So that is your notes payable. Kaya nalista naman ka sa utang, you need to pay that one, especially for loans sa bank, because you had already signed papers in which you need to pay for a couple of, let's say, months or years, probably depending on your arrangement. Okay, so that is notes payable. More on nana sa lista imuhang giutang, or you are already been noted sa imong giutang. So these are notes that you need to pay. So under siya sa imong accounts payable. So next is we have sources of long-term financing. So the first thing to know is, why do we need to have long-term financing? So the first one is we have long-term versus short-term. Okay, as you all know or familiar naman sa working capital, we have to met our long-term and short-term funds requirement or capital requirement in order for us to continue our operations of our business. So for short-term, more on capital, day-to-day na operation or activities or nga gasto, ato ang needed ang capital financing in order to operate and produce our products and services. But for the long term, what are the types? Kaya for the long term nga financing, so ma-expect ka nga this one would be much bigger, giving the time is for a longer period of time. So that's the first reason why we need long-term financing. Second is for, pardon the dogs. Okay, so the next one is for modernization, expansion, diversification. So these things, like magpa-modernize ta, we tend to upgrade, magpa-high-tech ta sa atong mga machineries, ato ang mga processes, mag-expand, mag-open og bagong nga branch guro or magtukod og bagong nga store. Diversification, probably dili lang kani imong gi-open or gihimo nga product, nag-diversify ka, mas daghan kag product nga gi-produce. So these activities really need huge amount, especially of capital financing. Kay kuan man siya kanang gasto gid ka siya. These are focused on purchasing new assets, purchasing new nga mga machines, purchasing new buildings, and so on and so forth. So again, these require very big amount. And with that, for long-term, gini siya nga financing. Medyo long-term po dato ang bayranon. So next is asset liability mismatch, interest rate risk, liquidity risk. So if long-term requirements is met by the short-term funds. So most of the time, another thing to consider is katong mga simple nga liability mismatch. So probably ma-short ta in some part of our business. Let's say after 5 years na short data, wala ta naka plan og ayo. So especially due to interest, mas nidako din interest due to inflation or due to nibagsak ang economy sa atong country. That's for example. Because in the future is unpredictable. We don't know what will happen in the future. And with that, if possible, we should have already enough funds to cater such unforeseen events or unforeseen events in the future. Dapat ready ka nga mo compromise and to fund anything that might happen, especially when it comes to interest or liquidity, so that you can continue your operation for your business. Mo gyud na ang iyang main goal para magpadayon gyud ang imong business to continue its operation. So that's the need for long-term financing. So the first source of long-term financing is number 1, equity capital. So what is equity capital? So these are authorized, issued, subscribed, and paid up capital. So they have par face value, issue price, book value, and market value. So in short, equity capital are based on good as money nga imong invest sa company. Equity capital is good as you are owning something sa business. So good as shareholder ka. You are buying a share of a certain company and owning that share. So again, mura kag nag-invest to be a part of that business, to be a part of that company. That is equity capital. More on money from you. More money to use in your business or to use in your business to operate. So if sole proprietorship ka, probably imuha lang yung whole amount, the whole capital itself. So that is good as equity capital. But if part is a corporation, so equity capital includes those stocks, shares, nag-buy sa imong mga shareholders. So as a shareholder dayon nga, let's say for example, you are part of the business na. You had used your equity capital to buy stocks or shares sa isa ka business. So with that means nga part na ka sa business. You are owing a small siguro or probably a big part of the business based on your share. So with that, you have many rights. So kay murag part naman ka or tag-iya naman ka sa business, so you have many rights to consider. So these are some of the general rights that you have as a shareholder. Number 1 is right to income. So this is profit after tax less preferred dividends. So good as earnings per share or dividends per share. So as a shareholder, you need to know that ratio. Okay, dito man ka mag-base nga hala tsada ba ni siya investan nga company given nga tsada ilahang earnings per share. So you as a shareholder, you have the right to know how much you will gain from the company. Mo gid ang number one. So, before ka mag-invest, mag-check sa kadaan nga makahalin maka-profit ba ko ani nga company. So, number one, you have the right to income. Dapat mahalinan ka based on your share. Next is right to control. You have voting rights. So, once you buy a share from the company, you are already, again, part of the whole system. Part na ka sa decision-making process. And the important decision to make is voting. Okay, sometimes voting in terms of, let's say, mag-appoint mo kinsa inyong CEO, COO, kinsang part sa inyong board, and so on, board of members or directors. So that's your right to control. Next is preemptive right. So for additional issues, right issues in the same or same proportion. So preemptive rights is kanang bitang additional issues nga additional issues or crucial decision-making ng mga activities in which you have also the right to participate. Kay part lagi ka sa whole, okay, especially sa shareholders. Okay, most of the time when it comes to crucial decision-making, it needs to reach consensus, at least katunga sa inyo ha, or 60 to 90% ang maka-vote or maka-amend sa inyong let's say, decision na ginamake. So that's preemptive right. Next is the right in liquidation. So these are residual claims over assets. So you as an stockholder, as an investor, shareholder, you have the right in liquidation. Liquidation in terms of assets. Let's say, for example, na-bankrupt daw si company. So, kay na-bankrupt si company, dili siya makabayad sa imo ha. So, what do you think is another way to pay you? Kay nag-invest ba ka? Let's say, for example, bali 1 million imong invest. So, what will happen is you have the right in liquidation. Kay nag-bankrupt man si company, you need to get an asset with the same amount, okay, which is 1 million. Basin imuha ang isa ka building or imuha ang mga sakyanan na worth 1 million, anything, any assets that is worth 1 million. So that is your right in liquidation. So most assets here na gina-describe is katong tangible, makita lang, such as buildings, mga planta, stores, machines, cars, and so on and so forth. So those are your right as an equity shareholder. If you have enough equity capital to invest in a business. Next is we have advantages of equity capital. So na po siya advantages. So the first one is wala siya fixed maturity and no obligation to redeem. That means nga at least unlimited iyang maturity. It may increase and increase ang iyang value over time. And you have no obligation to withdraw or redeem ang kaninga capital because wala ka obligation to redeem kay pwede man siya ma-convert to tangible assets. Di ba example na ganina? You can get the let's say for example 1 million worth nga building. So mo to mabawi ra gyud nimo siya in terms of that based on assets. Next is no compulsion to pay dividends. So with equity capital, dili bitaw mapugos pud si company nga mobayad sa imo. Kay good as you are part of the business naman daan. So okay in a minute. So no compulsion to pay dividends. So that means that dili sila need to pay maka-gain of dividend diretso. So dili kay siya compulsory to pay our shareholders that because again they are already part of your company. So it depends on the agreement you have with them. So they have an option. Next is provide leverage capacity. So if possible, Equity capital gives you leverage capacity. That means nga based on leverage ratio, it will give you more kind of attractiveness, especially for your investors. Mas dako siya over ratio yung ihatag sa inyo given na you will have higher equity capital. Yes, equity capital to calculate based on our net profit. So the more the merrier, the higher the ratio, the merrier it gets, and the more attractive your company is for other investors investors or financial institutions when it comes to loaning. Next is dividend tax exempt for investors. So your dividends are also wala siya tax, especially for investors because you'll get them as net. So your dividend per share will have no taxes. So that's the exemption. So they may be exempted on your dividends. Okay. Again, good as you are already part of the company. So there's no need for you to mas stress over ilas pa yun ug maayo ang imuhang share nagkakagain. So that is the advantage of equity capital. So with that, there is also disadvantages. So the first one is there is dilution of control of existing owners. Diba, as you can see, they have the right to control. So it is expected that the higher or the more equity capital that you have, the more okay, that means nga the more you have okay, that means nga the more you have authority or power over the others, especially let's say for example, you owe at least 50% sa company, 50% share. So talag sa kay basin mo kuan pud kay ka ba? Told you have more power compared the others. You have more voice compared the others to the others because of your share. So you can have delusion of control or mawala ka talaga sa passing. You might overpower others too much. Next, especially for the existing owners because they are more or less the one who will get the highest number of share in the company. So that is already expected. Next is high cost. So rate of return is expected by equity holders higher than debt holders. So it is most likely just to put down high cost based on rate of return. So most of the time, equity shareholders kay dili kay sila dako og halin dako og profit compared to debt holders given nga for debts naman interest. Okay? Na may utang. So with utang, there comes interest and interest plays a big part in gaining more profit or money from them. So that's why dili kayo dagko po daw og mabawi or halin ang ato ang mga investors or shareholders. Next is dividends are not tax deductible, hence cost is higher. So that is another rule to consider because dili man siya tax deductible, dili man siya minus ng tax, then that means na mas dagko po ang iyang cost. Mas dako po og minus. Mao gina ang reality actually na siya law sa BIR in which mas dako ang E minus sa imuha nga cost. Kaya di magkakuan og tax. Next is issue cost higher, underwriting, brokerage, other issues, expenses. So cost nga gina-issue sa imo as a shareholder would be bigger po og higher given again wala kang minus ng tax, especially with other expenses such as brokerage, issue expenses, imuhang mga stocks, and so on and so forth. So medyo pricey po gyud siya. Mong gamay ra ang mag-buy talag sa og stocks ug talag sa kung makabuy po sila is less than at least 5%. So depende lang po sa gina-offer ug ma-afford sa investors. So that's more or less likely will happen. So it always have higher cost issues. Next and lastly, we have higher servicing costs. They hold AGM's post-annual reports. Okay, so they have higher servicing costs too because they hold annual general meetings. So when it comes to general meetings, medyo costly good siya given nga events are very costly. Venue palang daan, food, and so on and so forth. And lastly, post-annual reports. So with that, may expect yun ka nga you tend to hire external nga mga auditors, accountants, in order for you to post those annual reports para mas ma-prepare siya mahanay, especially ma-check, ma-double check. So those are the purpose as to why we hire mga external nga mga people. External people are professionals when it comes to our reports. Okay, mo po ng mga disadvantages against equity capital. So, okay, so those are the disadvantages of equity capital. So next is we have this term, we have internal accruals. So it consists of depreciation charges and retained earnings. So we have again what we call internal accruals. They are composed of depreciation ng mga charges of retained earnings. So depreciation represents the allocation of capital expenditures to various periods over which the capital expenditure is expected to benefit the farm. So from the word itself, depreciation. So internal accruals, again, we have our assets. So when we talk about assets, we talk about equity, they tend to depreciate over time. So especially when it comes to capital expenditure, we are using our equity capital to buy various nga mga assets. So with that, those assets depreciate too over time. So with internal accruals, we'll know, okay, what are those charges and the retained earnings nga mabilin or naa. And why do we need to know this one? So it has advantages and disadvantages. Okay, so more on internal siya nga halin. Good as internal nga halin nga moapekto sa tuwang capital. Kay mo add up man ni siya sa capital, especially retained earnings and charges. So it has an advantage. Nice po ni siya nga long-term nga financing, another source. Another source siya because again, mura ka rolling sa imong money. So it is readily available. No talking to outsiders. Kay internal man siya. The word itself internal. So you are just rolling or using your money to operate. So gina-use mo siya as working capital. So it is effectively an additional equity capital. However, no issue cost of loss due to underpricing. So it is effective. Effective siya nga additional nga equity capital or working capital for your business, especially due to certain losses like underpricing costs and so on and so forth. So with internal accrual, wala siya delusion of control because the money you gained is from the company itself. So no one owes that money. So automatically lang siya ma-add sa inyuhang profit. So no one is able to take control of that. Next is no expansion in equity base, hence no dilution of earnings per share, okay, so this one is dili po siya mo expand ang imong equity base. Kaya mo siya dilution. So, wala ka siya that means nga wala kay interest. Kung wala interest, dito siya mo expand. Especially based on the earnings per share daw, the book value per share, and so on and so forth. So, more on profitability yapon siya. When we talk about capital, we are talking about profitability nga mga ratios. So, dili pod kani siya mo expand ang internal accruals. Again, kimura kag nag-rolling sa imuhang kwarta. Okay. So we also have disadvantages sa internal accrual. It has quantum, very limited. Okay, ang nakakuan yun siya kay limited lang siya. Limited lang siya in terms of mag-base lang po siya sa imong revenues. Mag-base lang po siya sa imong halin. Okay?